Welcome back, beautiful collective. I'm so glad you could join me for another reading of The Great Cosmic Mother, Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth. Okay, today we're going to read from pages 264 to 274. So it'll be 10 pages. All right, The Jealous God. Thank you for liking and subscribing, y'all. Really appreciate it. Okay, we're getting a lot of support and interest in the reading of the Great Mother, which, is completely understandable with this energy, right? So, the jealous God. In ancient Sumeria, sheepfold also meant vulva. In Sumeria and Near Eastern myth and custom, the shepherd king was consecrated in a sacred marriage to the Queen of Heaven, Inanna Ishtar. Under the eroticized veils of the beautiful young queen was the primordial Great Mother, she of the fruitful Neolithic garden. As Thompson points out, the shepherd king, Dumuzi, ensures the prosperity of his people by being a good lover to the goddess Inanna. The biblical King David was also a sacred shepherd. His sensual and ecstatic songs of earthly love, so untypical of the Bible, derive from the ancient love rites of the shepherd king and the goddess. Her Canaanite names were Asherah, Astarte, Ashtaroth. The settled people of the Old Testament, like everyone else in the Near East, practiced goddess worship. The Old Testament is the record of the conquest and massacre of these Neolithic people by the nomadic Hebrews, followers of a sky god, who then set up their biblical god in the place of the ancient goddess. The biblical Hebrews were a nomadic, pastoral, and patriarchal people, tribes of sheep herders and warriors who invaded land belonging to the matriarchal Canaanites. Both Hebrews and Canaanites were Semitic people. The Canaanites lived in agricultural communities and worshipped the orgiastic, ecstatic moon mother Astarte. As Old Testament stories relate, the Hebrews sacked, burned, and destroyed village after village belonging to the Canaanites, massacring or enslaving the people. A series of brutal invasions and slaughters described typically by theologians and preachers as a spiritual victory. In this way, the Hebrews established themselves on the land along with the worship of their sky and thunder god Yahweh, Jehovah, calling themselves his chosen people. Yahweh's male prophets and priests, however, despite their political victory over the Canaanites, had to carry on a continuous struggle and fulmination against their own people, who kept backsliding into worship of the Great Mother, the goddess of all their Near Eastern neighbors, for she had originally been the goddess of the Hebrews themselves. This constant fight against matriarchal religion and custom is the primary theme of the Old Testament. It begins in Genesis with the takeover of the goddess's garden of immortality by a male god and the inversion of all her sacred symbols, tree, serpent, moon fruit, woman, into icons of evil. Of the two sons of Eve and Adam, Cain was made the evil brother because he chose settled agriculture, which is matriarchal. The good brother, Abel, was a nomadic pastoralist. Yeah, patriarchal. Don't laugh. Okay, I'm trying. That's all I can do. The war against the goddess is carried on by the prophet's rantings against the golden calf, the brazen serpents, the great harlot and whore of Babylon, the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, okay, against enchantresses. We know that the Old Testament speaks heavily of so-called divination, right, and against witches. against enchantresses, pythonic diviners, okay, and those who practice witchcraft. It is in the prophets' war against the Canaanite worship of stone idols, the triple moon goddess, worshipped as three-horned pillars or menhirs. One of her shrines was on Mount Sinai, which means mountain of the moon. Moses was commanded by the Lord to go forth and destroy these idols who all had breasts. We are told monotheism began with the Jews, that it was the great spiritual invention of the religious leader Moses. This is not so. The worship of one God, like everything else in religion, began with the worship of the goddess. Her universality has been duly noted by everyone who has ever studied the matter. Monotheism, once thought to have been the invention of Moses or Akhenaten, was worldwide in the prehistoric and early historic world, i.e. throughout the Paleolithic and Neolithic ages. As E.O. James wrote in The Cult of the Mother Goddess, it seems that Evans was correct when he affirmed that it was a monotheism in which the female form of divinity was supreme. The original monotheism of the goddess is perhaps most clearly shown by the fact that, in Elizabeth Gould Davis's words, Almighty Yahweh, the God of Moses and the later Hebrews, was originally a goddess. His name, Iahu, Anat, derives from that of the Sumerian goddess Inanna. Okay. Yahweh, like all male gods, was first the bisexual goddess herself, then her son, then the lover of the goddess, a shepherd king. In his process of individualization from the goddess, he first appeared alongside her as in the time of Jeroboam. The goddess shared the temple with Jehovah. Eventually, he was turned by his priest and warrior followers into the supreme and only God. To enforce this new regime, the old goddess religion was damned, her people slaughtered. And the most stolen mythology of the new male god was written down by male prophets, a word that also meant poet, and thus given textual authority as the Word of God. But still, the unimprovable original maintained her influence in the hearts, bodies, and minds of the people. So deeply ingrained was the goddess cult in Palestine that it survived all attempts at drastic reformation by the Yahwist until the end of the monarchy. Baal, B-A-A-L, is one of the gods hated so drastically by the biblical Hebrews. Baal is a lord. Baltist means mistress and fair one. And this goddess was directly related to the Bel of the witches Beltane in pagan Europe. Whatever the Old Testament prophets have to say about these heathen idols, we must take with very large grains of salt, remembering that the prophets were the leaders of a holy political war against the people who worshiped the goddess. Moses, then, was not the inventor of monotheism or the recognition of one God. He was rather one of the chief male priests and architects of the new religion of one male God against the Neolithic goddess. In When God Was a Woman, Merlin's Stone suggests that the ruling Levites, the Hebrew priest caste, were in fact of Indo-European Aryan origin and lineage, belonging to that pastoral warrior tradition of male sky gods, gods of light. In the biblical Leviticus, these Levite priests introduced the earliest and most punitive and misogynistic laws against women yet written down in those times. They seemed consumed with hatred of the goddess and of women, especially the Canaanite and other neighboring matriarchal women who, in sensual joy and freedom, practiced their ancient moon rites. Interesting, y'all. It's so interesting. The Levite priesthood were intent on instituting patrilineal property and inheritance rights and the father-dominated family, based on women's total submission, social degradation, and spiritual disinheritance. Wow. The nerve. It follows that any sexual, economic, spiritual, or cultural freedom had autonomy in women, and autonomy in women. I'm sorry, let me reread that. It follows that any sexual, economic, spiritual, or cultural freedom and autonomy in women, their own tribal women, or any women in the neighborhood, was seen by the Levite priests as a threat to their new regime. The Levites were themselves an elite class, like the Hindu Brahmins, living in luxury and serviced by slaves. It is also true that Moses, the tribal the tribal leader of and chief priest of the Old Testament Hebrews, lived at the palace of Ramses II, the great pharaoh dictator of Egypt. Ramses II was the secular architect of the sun god political regime in Egypt. Moses resented the captivity of the Jews under this pharaoh and based a good deal of his religious political ideology on this understandable resentment, as the Bible records. But Moses was also well treated in the Pharaoh's palace and was educated there. Doubtless, it was the political success of Ramses' secular spiritual sun god organization that inspired Moses to try to construct the same kind of male god political order for his own people. It is also true that the Hebrews spent generations of captivity in Babylon, and the major myths of the Old Testament, the garden story, the flood story, the mythic historic struggle between the ancient agricultural goddess people and the new Bronze Age war god elites, were not original with the Hebrews, but taken by them from Semitic Babylonian legend and literature. Pre-patriarchal Levite priests and priestesses originated in cinnamon. No, it's not cinnamon. Sinim, cinnamon. That's what it says. Sinai, which meant land of the moon. Okay, they wore headdresses in the shape of lunar crescents. Sin, Sinn, was a Babylonian moon god, and Sinim might have been Babylon or Sumer. Both Yahweh and the Islamic Allah began as lunar gods, consorts of the goddess. Okay. Indeed, the Levite priests were originally serpent priests of the Great Mother. Levi is related to serpent, Leviathan, the world dragon of the goddess. Whether the biblical Levites derived from Aryan Indo-European roots or were Semites influenced by the all-conquering Indo-European warrior influences of the Bronze Age, we don't know. But just as a later misogynistic and, what is this word? Ascetic ensigns. Hold on. Okay, this word is
ascetic.
Ascetic Essenes. Ascetic Essenes.
Essenes.
Ascetic Essenes. Okay. They were once ecstatic priests of Artemis. It is very possible that patriarchal religion in the Near East, including the biblical religion of Yahweh, began in a violent revolt of these newly wealthy male priesthoods against the goddess they once served. Isn't that interesting? In The Gate of Horn by G. Rachel Levy analyzes the character of Yahweh as the psychological historical projection of a Bronze Age people growing apart from their ancient ways. The Hebrew tribes were pastoralist on the move, showing the restlessness of mind and ego characteristics of the Bronze Age. They were no longer immersed in the mutual effort of ritual, the cyclic goddess rituals designed to maintain the equilibrium of seasonal recurrence and the growth and renewal of man and beast. Their concept of God correspondingly became detached from earth, as they were experiencing themselves as detached, becoming separated, individuated, chosen, as a people no longer bound to the earthly cycles of the mother. As a result of this separation of the divine idea from its natural and animal affinities, the means of contact became gradually ethical. It is ironic that the concept of the male god and the people's relation to him becomes more ethical as the behavior of his Bronze Age male followers becomes correspondingly more greedy, violent, plundering, and corrupt. But this is a paradox we cannot resolve, except to say that ethics can be a substitute for being there. The means of contact between the Hebrew tribes and their God was ethical in the sense of becoming more rationalized, linear, individual, and intellectual. The old ecstatic, holistic experience of oneness with the earth and the goddess was gone. God could no longer be known, but instead had to be thought about and thought toward. The patriarchal priesthood must design verbal descriptions of God in the form of rules for how to act to get this God's attention. Because God is no longer all pervasively there, looking out from the inside and in from the outside. Ethical maps were written down to tell the mind and soul how to reach something that is acknowledged to be distant. As people separate more and more from oneness within the body, within the earth, within the cosmos, religious doctrine takes on the form of instructional maps on how to get there, how to get back. But maps based on God as a misogynistic male cannot take people back to the female source. Nor can an anti-earth, anti-physical God return us to the holistic epiphany of body, mind, and spirit inhabited as one. Oh, child, I love it, I love it, I love it. Don't you just love the truth? Don't you just love the sound of the truth, how this resonates with your soul because you know it's right? In Deuteronomy 16:20, it is said, "You shall not plant any tree as an Asherah beside the altar of God." The Asherah was the Neolithic goddess Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte, Ashtaroth, Asherah, or the symbol of the goddess. Real simple, right? It was see, just how things were just split. Everything was just split up. Just like you would take a mother's children, if something were to happen to her, if she was contained in some way, you would just split up her children. And maybe they would forget where they came from or who their brothers and sisters were or are. Okay. So it was a conventionalized or stylized tree perceived as she and planted therefore at all altars and holy places. This Asherah represented the goddess as Urkitu, the green one, the Neolithic mother-daughter of all vegetation, of agricultural knowledge and abundance. Yahweh's absolute hostility to the Asherah was the political hostility of the nomadic pastoral Hebrew people, or their priesthood at least, to the settled matriarchal cultures and their goddess beliefs. It became a psychological hostility to the entire living earth, doctrinalized in the biblical texts. You must completely destroy all the places where the nations you dispose or dispossess have served their gods, on high mountains, on hills, under a spreading tree. You must tear down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their sacred poles, and this means their Asherahs. Set fire to the carved images of their gods and wipe their name from that place. I'm quoting Deuteronomy 16:20. On a personal note, from my observation as I was reading the paragraph before this, I'm thinking about the Hebrew Israelite religion, which I was a part of for a few years. And, looking at this jealous God energy and what I'm reading, and then comparing that to that cult, that culture, that sect of religion, a break off from Christianity, or the black side. I know there's a white side too, or a European side also, but there's also an African side, American side, or whatever you want to call it, the dark side, let's say that, who also perpetrate this dominating the feminine energy, because they don't allow the women to speak, or the women have to be covered, and just another break off and continuation of more mess. So let's continue. This hostility to the living earth, to its deities and symbols, and to all free manifestations of its life can sometimes be seen in the way some fundamentalist and especially Mormon churches are built, at least in the American West. Every green tree, flower, or bush is stripped away from the stark stone anti-terrestrial arrogance of the buildings. Interesting. I've been saying that all through this whole thing, right? It's very interesting, very interesting. So the Old Testament text record the heroic age of the Hebrew people, the war gods epics of their priestly and warrior caste. The Bronze Age saw an explosion of such epics throughout the Near East, Egypt, and India. Gilgamesh appeared as the eagle of man, a new male being building a hostile identity vis-a-vis a woman, mocking and dismissing the ancient mother goddess in acts ranging from ritual desecration and mythic rewriting to the sacrilegious rape, massacre, and plundering of whole settled peoples. In the Old Testament of the Bible, written circa 900 to 300 BC, this ego of man is set up as the Hebrews' new god, Yahweh, the pastoral god of cattle breeding, warfare, moralistic wrath, and misogyny, is a newly militant, self-aggrandizing, and righteous male ego, enthroned as God the Father, enemy of the mother. Bronze Age raiding, mass slaughter, and secular conquest of settled matriarchal peoples by the mobilized patriarchal war machine were ubiquitous activities, not confined to the Hebrew tribes. The new element added by the Old Testament writers was a concept that became holy war. The Father God not only justified, but commanded the slaughter of religious enemies, i.e. of people who believed differently, in particular of people who believed in the old religion of the Neolithic goddess. This is where the breakdown of where you realize that racism and nationalism is really is just a cover, okay? Because it's all about what you believe and what your soul is desiring. It's who you're going to congregate with, who you're going to be family with, okay, negatively or positively. The outside doesn't matter. It's all about that spirit and that energy that you're carrying. All right. So the Hebrew warriors then were not just seeking conquest and wealth for personal glory like other Bronze Age sun god warriors and epic heroes. No, their righteousness comes from the fact that they were also seeking to impose the right God, their new idea of the right God, on all their neighbors. Textually, the Old Testament becomes the first handbook of the Holy War, i.e., the first time such an ideology was written down as the rules of the game, as the game itself, for a whole people. Both Christianity and Islam recognize the Old Testament as a sacred text. The historic fanaticism of both religions derives its holy war fervor and rationale from the words of the biblical prophets presented as the Word of God. These words incite and justify religious war as the will of God. Yahweh is called the jealous God. What was Yahweh jealous of? Of the goddess and her lover, of their sacred sexual relation itself, and of its domination over the minds and hearts and bodies of generations of Neolithic people. This is why the God and religion of the Bible are identified so clearly from all other preceding gods and religions. The Bible God and his religion are based on a violently asexual or anti-sexual morality never before seen on earth. Sex, the source of life and pleasure of love, becomes the enemy of God. All the ancient people of the world embodied the fused birth, life, and death-giving powers of earth and a mother goddess. Recognition of this paradoxical functioning of earth was universal. The Bronze Age Hebrews apparently perceived this primordial paradigm of earth as birth mother, sex mother, and death mother, all three in one, and couldn't handle it. They feared and or resented it so profoundly that in their religion, unique among all world religions, they wholly exterminated the mother and her earth. They wholly exterminated the mother and her earth, and thereby evolution itself and the cycles of its processes from their concept of deity. This is why it feels like we've been in a time warp, like things have been stopped because we've been put in the dark ages, okay, until this awakening that's presently happening. Nothing of sacredness remains but Yahweh, the war and morality God. Yahweh, who alone among all male gods of the earth, never has intercourse with a female. The yang has its yin. Sky fathers have earth mothers. Even the Vedic and later Indian male gods have female principles or other halves or wives with which they copulated. Not Yahweh. Yahweh is the only male god in the history of the world who never made love to a female or to the earth. In Christianity, this extraordinary phenomenon is continued in a son born without sex from a sexless virgin mother who counsels his male followers to eschew. Let me look up that word real quick. Hold on. Eschew. And that means to avoid and stay away from, deliberately. Stay clear of. Okay, so let me get back to what I was doing. To stay clear of sex and femaleness forever, if they want their spirits to reach heaven. That's how you reach heaven, girl. Yeah, if you know, you know. Thus did the ancient Hebrew Bible writers deal with their male fear and hostility toward the female sex by eliminating the female sex entirely from the creation or purpose of the world. To me, this is the foundation of men being jealous of women. Biblical misogyny was not exclusively a spiritual opposition to the goddess on the part of Yahweh's priesthood. It also was part of the Bronze Age political project of dominating large numbers of people via a royal priestly elite. Female blood was a sacred element in the agricultural rituals of all Neolithic people, including the matriarchal Canaanites. Blood was poured over sacred stones. Female blood, menstrual blood, was a signature of the psychic physical bonding of humans through the blood of their mothers and of the mother. Thus, in Leviticus, the Levite priest wrote down extremely positive. I'm sorry. I definitely did not mean that. Thus, in Leviticus, the Levite priest wrote down extremely punitive taboos and spiritual laws against female blood, menstrual blood, childbirth blood. What had been sacred for so long, the mother's bleeding for life. Who made the sacrifice? Whose blood are you saved by? Think about it. What had been sacred for so long, the mother's bleeding for life, was rewritten as a process of filth, shame, and physical spiritual corruption. When we know the significance of the ancient complex of women or woman, moon, menstrual blood in the Neolithic religions of humanity, and stretching back beyond even the Paleolithic, no doubt, then we can see the biblical portrayal of menses, woman, and sex as icons of filth and evil as a preeminently political move. This move was designed to take control over human life and the burgeoning Neolithic abundance by destroying their original communal bonding of people through the blood of their mothers, and to replace this with an enforced new hierarchical bonding based on the pastoral idea of a father god, keeper and breeder of herds, i.e., herds of cattle, capital. Female blood is tabooed, is no longer the medium of a spiritual communal bond. The new covenant is made with male blood, blood from the foreskins of circumcised male infants. This new tribal bond was elitist as well as sexist. The tribal god Yahweh was elevated to a one and only universal God, but still Yahweh was believed to recognize only the blood of Hebrew males in his special bondings, i.e., only Hebrew males can achieve this special relationship with God. For something like sacred group bonding menses to be denigrated to a corrupt process as it is in the Bible required a psychic overturning that was enormous. It wrenched the sexes out of balance to this day. We have still not recovered in the West from the act of primary alienation from the source of our earthly lives. No matter how sophisticated our technologies or how secular our lifestyles, we in the West, because our culture is so historically saturated with biblical imagery and worldview, still tend to be ruled by archetypal models of a male pastoral God whose power comes not from giving birth or enhancing life, but from dominating and breeding cattle herds as a sign of egotistic individual wealth, and dominating women as unclean but profitable cows as well. The puritanical morality of the Old Testament comes in some part from a misconstruing of ancient ritual and taboo. As Theodore Roszak points out in Where the Wasteland Ends, the Hebrew prophets looked at Epiphany and saw idolatry. Just so they looked at ancient sacred technologies and saw moralisms. Pagan Neolithic people did not have sex morality systems per se. Sex was sacred. Flesh was a manifestation of spirit, but spirit was related to energy, human and divine energy, and energy was experienced as easily imbalanced, mischallenged, or mischanneled or wasted. Pagan people designed rites of purification or energy concentration for special activities or occasions in which the soul energy was at risk through the intensity of the encounter or change it would be undergoing. The soul, as a sense of personal identity and belonging, was at risk in archetypal ontological situations: birth, puberty, mating, killing, eating, death. So men would undergo at least 3 days of sex abstinence before a hunt or battle. Ritual abstinence and purification were undergone before a mating or birth, or at puberty, or after a death. These purifications, concentrations of spirit energy, were a way of encountering any major life change or soul transformation which could threaten the balance of identity, personal and communal life, which is transpersonal. I'm not going to stop and, I usually don't take out my mistakes unless they're too bad here, so you're just going to have to bear with me. Hopefully you're following along with your own copy or the PDF that's online, okay? So let's continue. Whether these were or were not related to sexual activity, These ritual purifications were not moralisms. They were, in the phase of Mircea Eliade and Jerome Rothenberg, technologies of the sacred, ritual means of focusing and maintaining spiritual energy in all crises or archetypal transformations. The sacred among pagan people is related to magic simply because both are experienced as energy arts, techniques of gathering and directing energy toward a numinous or transphysical goal. Now, this is what the enemies have done to us. Okay, nothing's unaccounted for. Okay, everything works in the same way. Nothing new under the sun. So when the Hebrew prophets overthrew the great goddess and her pagan religion, they kept many of these purification techniques, but divorced them from magic or spirit arts. In doing this, they created moralisms, i.e., one abstains from sex at certain times, not to focus mind, body, spirit energy, but because sex is bad and immoral. The Judeo-Christian religious systems, in their own worldviews, have wholly denounced and extirpated the magic rites and reasons behind purification ceremonies, but retained the purification technologies themselves, ending up with a psychological fetish for cleanliness or purity, etc. Cleanliness is not next to God. Hold on. It says cleanliness is next to God and so forth. Really, since God is everything, cleanliness runs a very poor second. Sexual moralism builds on this fetishism to a pathological degree, filling people with an alienating sense of their own and others' bodily filth, with a fear and abhorrence of the body and its activities, and with projective systems that insist on the uncleanness of strangers and others, including the doctrines of racial purity and racial impurity. These sex moralisms and purity fetishes wow. Originally a misreading of pagan energy channeling techniques, have laid the basis for racism. My point exactly. As well as misogynistic sexism. They also lead to revulsion. Lead to revulsion against the sick, the elderly, the disabled. In the Old Testament, priests of Yahweh were required to be pure, i.e. physically perfect, whatever the hell that means. No person, this is so crazy, man. I hope y'all getting this in y'all's brain the way mine is opening up as I read this, okay? Never too old. You don't know enough. Never too old to learn something new, even if you already knew it. It's just being aware of what you know. No person with an illness, with a handicap or blemish or non-male body style, no blind or deaf person, no lame person, no epileptic, no incontinent person, no dwarf, no hunchback, no woman whatsoever is allowed to approach the altar of God. Not because their energy might be temporarily or accidentally diffused or unbalanced, but because they are unclean in the eyes of God, i.e. spiritually inferior. So biblical homophobia is another manifestation not only of sex moralism, but of the Hebrew prophets' political hostility toward the people and practices of other religions, specifically goddess religion. As Thompson writes, the image of bisexuality is universally stressed in shamanistic practices. The excessive Hebrew condemnation and punishment of homosexuality, which was, after all, a common and universal Neolithic practice, was not simply a revulsion toward a particular unnatural sexual activity. It was an attack on all shamanistic, ecstatic religion against the bisexual image, theory, and practice of the great goddess. The balancing of female and male energies was always the goal of Upper Paleolithic and Neolithic religions. Bisexuality, male homosexuality, lesbianism are the symbolic and real enactments of this balancing vision. To live the other in the self, to live the self in the other, to free oneself from gender or enlarging gender experience to total experience, as stated in their texts and doctrines. The spiritual goal of the pastoral Hebrew prophets and kings was the separation and mutual hostility of the female and male energies. Their ultimate political goal was the punishment of the female by the male to the degradation of both. Biblical homophobia, the condemnation of people engaging in homosexual acts to death by stoning, the cursing of homosexuals beyond the grave, was a direct consequence and a mechanism of the Hebrew prophets' project to vilify and destroy goddess cultures as evil while setting up their own anti-sexual god in her place. Homophobia is a necessary psychological attribute of the religion of Yahweh, i.e., if Yahweh has never had sex with a female, goddess or mortal, nor never has sex with a male, then what is Yahweh? He is pure spirit, that is, a Hebrew male above sex, above life. This is supposed to indicate Yahweh was transcended or outployed, the Neolithic great goddess. What effect did this new Yahweh of the biblical prophets have on the lives of Hebrew women, who, like all other Neolithic women, had once enjoyed the freedom, dignity, and dynamic energy of living as women in the universe of the goddess? This is a story for Jewish women to tell. It seems historically true that, as Christian feminist theologian Rosemary R. Ruther writes, Hebrew women, if biblical times, were the first to undergo a God-willed social, physical, and spiritual oppression that has since become the experience of all women in the West and in the East under various forms of the same patriarchal, misogynistic worldview. The picture of women obtained from the Old Testament laws can be summarized in the first instance as that of legal non-person, where she does become visible. It is as a dependent and usually an inferior in a male-centered and male-dominated society. Under the purity taboos of Leviticus 12, it was ordained that Hebrew women who gave birth to sons were unclean for 7 days and must purify themselves for 33 days following childbirth. A woman bearing a daughter is unclean for 66 days, and she must then make a sin offering as an atonement for bearing a female. In 1 Samuel 21:4, it is said, "Men are holy who stay away from women." Yahweh and his prophets had a strong urge to punish Hebrew women for their sensuality, their vivacity, and their autonomy under the goddess. Here is one of many such passages from Isaiah 3:16-17. This reminds me of Lilith. This is where the Lilith energy comes from. So, moreover, the Lord saith, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and and walk with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go, and making a tinkling with their feet, therefore the Lord will smite with a scab the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will discover their secret pots. Meaning sexual punishment, sexual humiliation, and pejorative sexual epithets are disturbingly common in this book of male prophets and holy men. As Ruth Hermans Green says in her wonderful book, The Born Again Skeptic's Guide to the Bible, the prophets are faithful in recording the Lord's propensity for humiliation of the female sex by comparing sinful cities and nations to it. The trashing of evil cities and cities following their other religions as whorish and harlots and places of fornication is common to Yahweh and his prophets. But Hebrew cities do not escape the continuous flow of misogynist cursing either, as in Lamentations 1:17. Jerusalem is a menstruous woman. When holy war mentality is joined with such woman hatred, there is the targeted slaughtering of women and children as blood bearers of the hated neighboring religions and cultures. The book of Ezekiel reeks with it. Slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children and women, but come not near any man upon whom is the mark. Fill the courts with the slain. Ezekiel 9:6-7. In the Old Testament is a metaphor of the king who builds his house above a privy. This seems to refer to ecstatic or orgiastic rites practiced by the Canaanites in honor of the goddess, which the Hebrew patriarchs and prophets could not see as anything but prostitution and vile whorishness. The opinion of the Hebrew patriarchs that human sexual activity is basically vile and of the gutter, ultimately of the devil, was echoed centuries later by Tertullian, 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 an intellectual father of the early Christian church, who proclaimed that woman is a temple over a sewer. Now, if that ain't jealousy, I don't know what is. Thank y'all for joining me. I hope y'all like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave a comment, and I'm going to see you next time. Y'all stay blessed. Bye-bye.